greedy, relentless flames rise to the leaden Paris sky. It is March 13th, 1314. The cold spring air fills with the scent of burning flesh and final prayers. On the Île aux Juifs, in the middle of the Seine, under the shadow of Notre Dame's unfinished towers, a 7-year tragedy reaches its end. This is the apex of cruelty and cold state calculation. Atop the pyre, engulfed in fire, stands Jacques de Molay, the 23rd and last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, once the most powerful and wealthy organization in Christendom. His white robes are blackened, his gray beard has ignited like a torch. But his eyes, according to the few horrified chronicles, burn with an unbearable prophetic fire. This is not the agony of a broken old man. This is a final act of defiance. And he speaks. His voice, amplified by the river and the ringing silence of the crowd, addresses not his executioners, but those watching from the royal palace. He calls upon the judgment of God, summoning Pope Clement V and King Philip IV to answer before the Almighty within 1 year. This is not a plea for mercy. It is a curse, hurled from the very heart of the inferno. In this moment, before all of Paris, something more than the execution of a heretic is happening. This is the ritual burning of a debt. King Philip, watching with a cold, unreadable expression, is finally closing his main ledger. He owed the Templars vast sums of money. He owed them for the financial stability of his kingdom. And now he pays, not with gold, but with fire, turning his debts to ash and his creditors to martyrs. The central paradox of the scene is stunning. The most powerful monarch in Europe, the most Christian king of France, is solving his financial crisis through monstrous sacrilege, using the holy fire of the Inquisition as a tool of fiscal policy. How? How did he manage to turn an elite knightly order, the glory of Christendom, into a coven of heretics in the eyes of the world, just to legally and publicly burn his obligations to them? This pyre is not just an ending. It is a living, smoking question, the answer to which lies in a labyrinth of politics, religion, and human nature, in the very essence of a ruthless, pragmatic new world being born. To understand how a monarch descended from saints could reach this pinnacle of cruelty, we must go back. Back to the world that created both the king and his victims. Europe at the end of the 13th century, a chessboard set for a final, deadly game. This world was filled with a sense of twilight and uncertainty. The great era of the Crusades, 2 centuries that had fueled Europe's religious fervor, military energy, and economic ambition, had ended in disgrace in 1291 with the fall of Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land. The dream of reclaiming the Holy Sepulchre had evaporated, leaving only the bitter taste of defeat and an existential vacuum. The military monastic orders born in the fire of these crusades, primarily the Templars and Hospitallers, lost their original purpose. From the vanguard of Christendom, they had transformed into incredibly wealthy and influential multinational corporations, their fortress-like commanderies covering Europe in a dense network. At the same time, another pillar of the medieval world was cracking, the universal power of the papacy. The Roman pontiffs, once able to depose emperors with a single word, increasingly clashed with the growing power of secular monarchs who no longer wished to see papal viceroys in their kingdoms. Against this backdrop, like a titan from old legends, a new phenomenon was rising, the centralized nation-state. And nowhere was this process more relentless or brutal than in France, under the rule of Philip IV. His kingdom was the most populous, his army the strongest, his capital, Paris, the intellectual and cultural heart of the Christian world. But this factual supremacy was not enough for Philip. He craved absolute, indisputable sovereignty, both at home and abroad. In this new reality he was forging, there was no room for autonomous powers not directly subordinate to the crown. Any entity, be it rebellious feudal lords, an independent church, or an international order centered in Rome, was seen as an anomaly, a tumor on the body of the perfect state, requiring immediate surgical removal. The world stood on the threshold of a new era, where the idea of a universal Christian empire was giving way to the doctrine of national interest, and the chivalric code was being replaced by cold state calculation. And the Templars, with their colossal wealth, independence, and obsolete mission, stood directly in the path of this tectonic shift, personified by the Iron King. Philip IV, who ascended the throne in 1285, was a living paradox, a product of his transitional age. In his veins flowed the blood of the Capetian dynasty, which had ruled France for over 3 centuries and given the world one of its most revered saints, his own grandfather, Louis IX. Saint Louis was the embodiment of the ideal medieval monarch, pious, just, personally leading crusades, and dying with a prayer on his lips. He left behind a legacy of holiness that enveloped the French monarchy in a special, sacred aura. Philip inherited this aura of the most Christian king, but he filled it with a completely different, frightening substance. Behind the angelic appearance that earned him the nickname the Fair hid a character of an entirely different metal. If Louis was made of the gold of faith and chivalry, Philip was forged from cold, unbending steel. It is no wonder that posterity and historians would give him another, far more accurate nickname, the Iron King. This contrast between grandfather and grandson was not just a family drama. It reflected a shift in the very paradigm of power. Louis ruled as the supreme arbiter of the feudal world, his authority based on moral prestige and tradition. Philip, however, thought in terms of the absolute state. For him, piety was not a goal, but a tool. Law was not divine justice, but the will of the sovereign. The church was not the highest authority, but just another department of his kingdom. He was the first truly modern ruler in Europe, for whom the abstract concept of France and its interests stood above any personal, dynastic, or religious obligations. The shadow of his saintly grandfather served as an ideological shield, legitimizing his actions. But it also created the monstrous contrast that so shocked his contemporaries. How could the grandson of a crusader who died for the faith become the persecutor of the most celebrated order of crusaders? The answer lay in the fact that Philip saw himself as continuing his ancestors' work, but in a new, twisted form. If Louis sought to build the kingdom of God on earth, Philip was building his own kingdom, absolute and earthly. And in this kingdom, he intended to be the supreme deity, tolerating no rivals. Even before his actions horrified Christendom, his nickname, the Iron King, sounded like an omen, a prophecy of the unbending and merciless will hidden behind his flawless appearance. Iron is the metal of war, but also of chains, bars, and instruments of torture. It is cold, hard, and inflexible. These very qualities defined Philip IV's style of rule. He did not seek compromise, acknowledge half measures, or suffer doubts. His goal was clear and absolute: the creation of a single, centralized, and sovereign France, where the king's will was the only law. He saw any obstacle not as a problem to be negotiated, but as a flaw in the universe to be corrected with surgical steel. This iron resolve became state ideology. Philip and his inner circle were deeply convinced of the special, almost messianic mission of the French monarchy. They believed the King of France received his power directly from God, without the Pope or anyone else as an intermediary, and was accountable only to him. This doctrine, known as legalism, turned the king into the living embodiment of the state, and the state itself into the highest earthly value. Consequently, any encroachment on the crown's rights, whether refusing to pay taxes, appealing to the Pope's court, or the existence of an independent military force within the kingdom, was seen not just as a crime, but as sacrilege. It was heresy against the new religion, the religion of the state. The prophecy of the Iron King was fulfilled in his every action. With an iron grip, he extracted money from his subjects, imposing new taxes. With iron resolve, he waged wars to expand his kingdom. And with iron logic, he concluded that the Knights Templar, with their international status, immense wealth, and direct allegiance to the Pope, was a foreign body within his ideal monarchy. They were a state within a state, and the Iron King could not tolerate it. Thus, the future destruction of the order was not a spontaneous act of tyranny driven by a lack of money. It was the logical conclusion of his entire political philosophy, foretold by the very nature of his iron reign. The character of this monarch, capable of challenging the very foundations of the world order, was forged in the unique atmosphere of his era and upbringing. Philip's youth coincided with the peak of medieval scholasticism at the University of Paris, but at the same time, a new doctrine was spreading from Italy: revived Roman law. This intellectual dualism shaped his worldview. On one hand, he was a deeply, perhaps sincerely religious man, raised in the cult of his saintly grandfather. He attended Mass, observed fasts, and positioned himself as a defender of the faith. However, his piety was of a specific kind. It was not humble or forgiving, but militant, intolerant, and absolutely certain of its own righteousness. Philip saw himself as the sword of God, but a sword that served God directly by serving his kingdom. On the other hand, his closest circle consisted not of theologians or barons, but of a new breed of men, professional lawyers, or legists. These men, often of humble origin but with sharp minds and an iron grip, were fanatics of the state idea. Figures like Pierre Flotte, Enguerrand de Marigny, and especially Guillaume de Nogaret became his true teachers and his greatest weapons. They instilled in the young king the doctrine derived from Roman law. What pleases the prince has the force of law. They taught him that royal power was absolute, indivisible, and could not be limited by feudal customs or church canons. To them, the Pope was merely the Bishop of Rome, not the master of all Christians. This forge of character, where the anvil was a fanatic belief in his divine destiny, and the hammer was the cold legalism of his advisors, created the Iron King. He learned to speak the language of religion while pursuing purely state objectives. He learned to use law not as an instrument of justice, but as a weapon to destroy his enemies. The destruction of the Templars would be the pinnacle of this education. He would accuse them of the most heinous religious crime, heresy, but he would try them using the template of his state machine, where a confession obtained under torture outweighed any presumption of innocence, and the king's will surpassed any papal bull. The first tests of this new, ruthless state machine took place long before the Templar process, on battlefields and in royal offices. The wars Philip waged almost continuously became both his training ground and his harsh lesson. The conflict with King Edward I of England over Gascony, and especially the bloody war with the wealthy cities of Flanders, demanded colossal resources. It was then that Philip began to hone his methods of extracting money at any cost. He taxed everyone, including the clergy, which led to his first clash with Rome. He expelled Jews and Lombard bankers from the country, confiscating all their property first. He practiced debasement of the coinage, systematically reducing the precious metal content in coins while maintaining their face value. This was, in essence, a hidden tax that caused inflation and popular unrest. But the real moment of truth, the first metaphorical blood, was the catastrophic defeat of the French knights at the Battle of the Golden Spurs at Kortrijk on July 11th, 1302. There, the flower of French chivalry, one of Europe's finest armies, was utterly routed by a Flemish militia of craftsmen and townsfolk. It was not just a military fiasco, it was a terrible blow to the crown's prestige, and, just as importantly, to its finances. The battle not only claimed the lives of many great lords, but also emptied the treasury to such an extent that continuing the war became impossible without extreme measures. The lesson of Kortrijk was twofold for Philip. First, he learned that chivalric valor alone did not guarantee victory in this new world. He needed money, lots of money, to hire professional soldiers and maintain a huge army. Second, he realized he must act not only with force, but with cunning, intrigue, and propaganda. It was after this defeat that his fiscal policy became even more aggressive, his methods even more cynical. He learned to lose battles but win wars, using legal and financial leverage. This experience prepared him for the main campaign of his life. When he turned his gaze to the Templars, he would not just be a king, but a seasoned fighter who knew that in victory, all means are justified, and that the most effective blow is a sudden one, delivered from behind under the cover of law. Behind all these wars, financial schemes, and political intrigues lay Philip's deep, almost manic obsession, his secret motivation, which was far more complex than simple greed. In his mind, the idea of the French state had merged with the idea of a sacred, divine mission. He was not just ruling a country, he was building a temple of absolute monarchy, with himself as the high priest. This quasi-religious faith in the state was his primary inner demon, driving him to the most radical actions. In this value system, anyone who questioned the fullness of his power was not just a political opponent, but a heretic, an enemy of the sacred order. His debt to the Templars was humiliating, not so much financially. Kings before him had borrowed and defaulted, but ideologically. The very fact that an organization existed on his land that possessed enormous wealth, military power, castles, and lands, yet answered not to him, but to a distant pope in Rome, was an unbearable insult to his majesty. The Templars were the living embodiment of the old, supranational world he sought to destroy. They were an anomaly in his tidy worldview. Their wealth was not just money. It was a symbol of their independence, their power. Their international connections made them uncontrollable. Their privileges, granted by popes, placed them above his law. Therefore, when Philip looked at the temple fortress in Paris, where his own treasury was also stored, he saw not his banker, but his rival. He saw a state within a state, a cancerous tumor on the body of his France. The debt was merely a pretext, convenient and understandable to all. The true reason was far deeper. He didn't just need to avoid paying his bills, he needed to destroy the very model of the Templars' existence. He needed to prove, once and for all, that on French soil there was only one power, one will, and one law, his. And to achieve this goal, he was ready to use the most terrifying tool available in that era, the accusation of heresy, which not only allowed for the confiscation of property, but also for the complete moral and physical annihilation of the enemy, turning a creditor into a fiend from hell. To realize such an ambitious and risky task, Philip needed the right instrument, a powerful and extensive state machine capable of executing his will in every corner of the kingdom. And he built it with iron consistency. Unlike his predecessors, who relied mainly on feudal ties, Philip gambled on a professional bureaucracy. He significantly expanded the royal administration, creating an army of officials who owed their positions not to noble birth, but to personal ability and loyalty to the crown. In the provinces, his power was represented by seneschals and bailiffs, vested with broad judicial, financial, and military powers. The central government was concentrated in the royal council, where his faithful legists, Guillaume de Nogaret, Pierre Flotte, Enguerrand de Marigny, played the leading roles. These men were the regime's think tank. Under Philip, the Parlement of Paris, the kingdom's highest court, flourished, becoming a powerful tool in the fight against feudal and ecclesiastical jurisdiction. A chamber of accounts was created to control finances. In essence, Philip was building a prototype of the modern state, with a separation of powers not for balance, but for efficiency of control. This bureaucratic army was completely loyal to its creator. The officials received salaries, lands, and titles from the king, and were invested in strengthening his power as it strengthened their own. This machine made the unprecedented operation to arrest the Templars possible. Only a centralized and efficient administration could, in a single day, at a single hour, across the entire kingdom, capture thousands of men and seal hundreds of properties without leaks or organized resistance. Philip had created a monster, and now he was ready to unleash it on his enemies. By the beginning of the 14th century, France under Philip IV was the undisputed hegemon of Western Europe, a true superpower of its time. The continent's geopolitical landscape was defined by its power and ambitions. With a population estimated between 15 and 20 million, it was more than 3 times larger than its main rival, England. This demographic advantage translated into a huge tax base and mobilization potential. Paris was not just a capital, but a true metropolis of the era, the center of power, science, and culture. It housed the most prestigious university in Europe and was home to the greatest minds and most skilled artisans. Philip sought to convert this power into undeniable political influence. His foreign policy was aggressive and expansionist. He fought a stubborn war with England for control of its continental holdings. He sought to subdue Flanders, one of Europe's richest and most developed regions. This demonstration of strength had a downside. It required a constant flow of money. Wars, diplomacy, fortress construction, and the maintenance of a bloated bureaucracy consumed colossal sums that were always in short supply. It was in this context of growing power and chronic financial hunger that the role of the Knights Templar became particularly significant and simultaneously irritating to Philip. They were his chief bankers, but their wealth and independence challenged his own dominance. In the world he was building, France was to be the only center of power. And when he looked at the map of Europe, he saw only one anomaly, one transnational organization that did not fit into his new, nation-focused picture, and it was marked with the red cross of the Templars. In his quest to fill the perpetually empty treasury, Philip shrank from no method, demonstrating a tactical genius that bordered on state-sponsored banditry. One of his favorite and most destructive tools was the debasement of the coinage. This mechanism was essentially state-controlled inflation, disguised as monetary reform. The royal mints would issue coins with the same face value, but with less silver or gold. The difference in metal value went straight into the treasury. Then, the king might announce a return to sound money, forcing the populace to sell back the debased coins at a lower rate, turning another profit. He repeated this operation multiple times throughout his reign, earning him another unflattering nickname, the Counterfeiter King. From the perspective of a short-term budget fix, it was a tactical masterpiece. In the long term, however, it was a disaster. The constant monetary manipulation destroyed trade, caused sharp price hikes, and led to widespread impoverishment and riots. This financial unscrupulousness created an aura around Philip of a ruler for whom nothing was sacred, and it was directly relevant to his future attack on the Templars. First, it showed his desperate financial situation. Second, it demonstrated his willingness to break any established norm. If he could deceive his entire kingdom, what would stop him from deceiving one knightly order? And third, it set a dangerous precedent. If one could confiscate a portion of the savings of the entire nation, why not confiscate all the wealth of a single, influential group after first accusing them of every mortal sin? In this grand drama of power and money, the key roles were played by figures as extraordinary as the king himself. His strength was multiplied by his advisors, who were not mere servants, but co-authors of his policy. Chief among them, without a doubt, was Guillaume de Nogaret, the keeper of the seal. A law professor, he was a fanatic for the idea of the nation-state and a personal enemy of the papacy. Rumor held his ancestors were Cathars, burned at the stake by the Inquisition. Nogaret was the true evil genius of the regime, a brilliant lawyer, a master of intrigue, ruthless and completely devoted to the king. He was the brain behind the operation against Pope Boniface VIII and the chief architect of the Templar process, developing the entire legal and propaganda strategy for their destruction. The other pillar of the throne was Enguerrand de Marigny, the king's coadjutor, who ran the finances. He was a master of finding money from nothing, the inventor of new taxes, and the chief executor of the counterfeiter policy. But Philip had not only allies, he had a sworn enemy who personified everything he hated: Pope Boniface VIII. Ambitious, domineering, and a brilliant canon lawyer, Boniface was the last great defender of papal theocracy, the doctrine of the supremacy of spiritual power over secular. The conflict between these two titans, Philip, embodying the sovereign nation-state, and Boniface, championing the universal power of the Church, was inevitable. It was not just a dispute between two men, but a clash of two worlds, two epochs. Victory in this battle would become Philip's key to success in his future war on the Templars, as the Pope was their only supreme protector. The point of no return, the crossroads of fate that led directly to the Templars' tragedy, was Philip's open conflict with Pope Boniface VIII. The spark that lit the fire was, as it so often is, financial. While waging costly wars, Philip imposed a tax on the clergy in 1296 without Rome's consent. For Boniface, this was unheard-of audacity. He responded with the bull Clericis Laicos, forbidding secular rulers from taxing the clergy under threat of excommunication. Philip countered with elegant cruelty. He banned the export of gold and silver from France, cutting off the papacy's main source of income. The conflict subsided, but flared up again in 1301. The king arrested a papal legate, accusing him of treason. This was a direct violation of canon law. In response, Boniface prepared a bull to excommunicate Philip. The conflict culminated in November 1302 with the famous Bull Unum Sanctum. In this document, Boniface articulated the doctrine of papal omnipotence. There are two swords, the spiritual and the temporal, and both belong to the Church. The spiritual sword is wielded by the Pope. The temporal sword is granted to kings, who must wield it at the direction of the priest. The bull ended with an unconditional declaration: submission to the Roman pontiff is for every human creature an absolute necessity of salvation. This was a direct, deafening challenge to Philip's entire political philosophy. It was an ultimatum. The king had to either submit, acknowledging himself a vassal of the Pope, or go to the end, committing the unthinkable. For the Iron King, the choice was obvious. He didn't just accept the challenge, he decided to destroy the one who threw it. In response to the papal ultimatum, Philip and his advisors played a hand that forever changed the balance of power in Europe and demonstrated the peak of the French crown's might. It was a moment of absolute pride, the hubris of Greek tragedy when a mortal defies the gods. Instead of repenting, Philip went on the offensive. Backed by the Estates General, the first assembly of its kind in French history, he accused Boniface himself of heresy, simony, murder, and even consorting with the devil. But the height of this audacity was the infamous slap at Anagni. While Boniface was in his hometown of Anagni in September 1303, preparing to excommunicate Philip, a band of mercenaries burst in, led by Guillaume de Nogaret and an Italian noble, Sciarra Colonna, the Pope's mortal enemy. They stormed the palace, and, according to legend, Colonna struck the 86-year-old pontiff with his iron gauntlet. While the physical slap is disputed by historians, what is certain is that the Pope was arrested and subjected to unprecedented humiliation. He was held captive for 3 days. Though the townspeople eventually freed him, the shock was too great. A month later, Boniface VIII was dead. Christendom was in shock. Never before had a secular ruler dared to raise a hand against the Vicar of Christ. Philip had committed sacrilege, but he emerged from the conflict as the absolute victor. He had not only eliminated his chief rival, but had demonstrated to all that the French crown was now a force to be feared more than the papal tiara. This episode was the dress rehearsal for the Templar process. Philip had seen in practice the effectiveness of his methods: total propaganda, accusations of heresy, and the use of brute force under a legal pretext. And above all, he saw the vulnerability of the papacy itself. If he could break the Pope, what could stop him from breaking an order that was merely the Pope's creation? Victory over Boniface, however, did not solve the kingdom's main problem, an empty treasury. On the contrary, the wars had only deepened the financial crisis. The state debt had reached astronomical levels, and the French crown's chief creditor was the Knights Templar. Having lost their military mission in the East, the Templars had definitively transformed into Europe's largest banking system. Their Paris headquarters, the Temple, an impregnable fortress in the heart of the capital, held not only the Order's own treasures, but also the state treasury of France, royal archives, and the savings of many nobles. King Philip himself had repeatedly used their services, borrowing enormous sums. And now this wealth, which had once been a support, began to look like a mortal threat. The first cracks in the relationship began to appear. The king increasingly delayed payments, demanded new loans, and watched the prosperity of his creditors with growing irritation. But it wasn't just about the money. The Order's autonomy and international status provoked an existential anxiety in Philip, who was obsessed with total control. The Templars were exempt from royal taxes, answerable only to the Pope's court, and their Grand Master was equal in influence to European monarchs. Their castles were a state within a state. Envy and fear were mixed with suspicion. The secrecy with which the Order shrouded its internal rituals and chapters generated a mass of public rumors. This veil of secrecy, once part of their mystical aura, now became their Achilles' heel. For a king looking for a pretext to attack, this secrecy was a gift. It allowed the vacuum of knowledge to be filled with the most monstrous accusations, which the common people would readily believe. Wealth, independence, and secrecy, these 3 pillars of the Templars' power, became the 3 nails for their future coffin. The storm was approaching. The fatal act that set the machine of destruction in motion was carried out in deep secrecy, presumably in 1306, in a chamber of the royal palace. It was a secret meeting, attended only by the king and his most trusted advisors, led by Guillaume de Nogaret. It was here that the plan was approved, a plan staggering in its audacity, scale, and cynicism. the decision was made. The debt to the Templars would not be repaid. It would be nullified, along with the creditors themselves. But simple dissolution was not enough. To legally seize their wealth and avoid condemnation, he needed something more. He had to destroy them morally, to trample their reputation, to turn the heroes of the Crusades into fiends from hell. And the only accusation that achieved all these goals at once was heresy. Heresy automatically outlawed the accused, making them an enemy of all Christendom. The process for matters of faith was handled by the Inquisition, which was famous for its methods of obtaining truthful testimony. And most importantly, the property of convicted heretics was subject to full confiscation. The plan developed by Nogaret was flawless in its diabolical logic. It involved several key stages. First, gathering evidence and preparing public opinion by spreading monstrous rumors. Second, the sudden and simultaneous arrest of all Templars in France to deny them any chance to resist or move their treasure. Third, the immediate start of an interrogation using torture to obtain the necessary confessions. Fourth, using these confessions to pressure the Pope into authorizing the process and dissolving the order. This was the point of no return. Philip was betting everything: his reputation, his relationship with the papacy, and the stability of Europe. But the prize in this game was too high to resist: total control and countless riches that would solve all his financial problems and allow him to continue building his empire. The mechanism was set in motion. The key element in Philip's plan was the subjugation of papal authority, turning it from the Templars' potential defender into a pliable instrument of their destruction. After the death of Boniface and his brief successor in 1305, under immense pressure from the French crown, a Frenchman, Bertrand de Got, was elected pope. He took the name Clement V. He was a weak, indecisive, and ill man who owed his career entirely to Philip. He never even went to Rome for his coronation, holding it in Lyon, in France. Then, in 1309, he took an unprecedented step. He moved the papal residence from the eternal city of Rome to the small town of Avignon in southern France. Thus began the nearly 70-year period known to history as the Avignon Papacy. Although Avignon was not technically part of the French kingdom, the Pope was effectively under the complete military, political, and financial control of the Iron King. Now, Philip's hands were untied. Clement V found himself in a tragic position. On one hand, he probably did not believe the Templars were guilty. On the other, he was terrified of Philip. The French king constantly held a sword over his head, the threat of opening a posthumous trial against Boniface VIII on charges of heresy. Such a trial would be a catastrophe for the Catholic Church, plunging Christendom into chaos. Blackmailed and intimidated, Clement V was forced to make concessions. He became an unwilling accomplice in the order's destruction, trying only to save what little he could, the appearance of legality and the authority of his office. But in reality, he was just signing the documents Philip's legists put in front of him, legitimizing lawlessness with his papal seal. The first stage of the diabolical plan was a massive smear campaign, a true information war waged against the unsuspecting order. The king's agents and spies, operating throughout France, began to purposefully collect and spread the most vile and absurd rumors about the Templars. They claimed that new recruits were forced to deny Christ 3 times, spit on the crucifix, and kiss their superiors in obscene places. It was alleged that in their secret chapters, the knights worshipped a bearded idol named Baphomet and sacrificed infants to it. They were accused of practicing and encouraging sodomy, considered one of the most horrific sins. These rumors, like toxic seeds, fell on fertile ground. envy of the Templars' wealth, their arrogance, and their secrecy had long fostered public resentment and suspicion. Now, those vague feelings took on a concrete, terrifying form. People who one day had admired the Knights of Christ were, the next, whispering about their satanic rituals. Philip's propaganda machine worked flawlessly. By the time of the arrest, public opinion was already prepared. The Templars had been transformed from heroes into monsters, from creditors into conspirators, threatening the very foundations of faith and state. This campaign was critical. First, it created the ideological justification for the future crackdown, presenting it not as state-sponsored robbery, but as a holy war against heresy. Second, it paralyzed any will to resist. When the king's men came, the local populace would not support the knights. They would view them as servants of the devil. Thus, Philip struck not only with the sword, but with the word, proving that slander, when elevated to state policy, can be more terrifying than any army. Once public opinion was sufficiently inflamed, Philip delivered his main blow, an event that went down in history as Operation Iron Net. It was a police operation on a scale and with a precision that medieval Europe had never seen. In absolute secrecy, sealed orders were sent to seneschals and bailiffs throughout the kingdom. They contained detailed instructions. Open the packet on the night of October 12th, 1307, and proceed immediately. The order was simple and terrible. At dawn on Friday, October 13th, arrest every single Templar in their territory, seize their property, and seal their commanderies. The date was no accident. Friday was considered an unlucky day, the day of Christ's crucifixion, and the number 13, the devil's dozen. This was intended to add a mystical, sinister overtone to the event in the eyes of the superstitious populace. The operation proceeded with stunning efficiency. At dawn on that fateful day, thousands of royal soldiers and officials simultaneously knocked on the gates of hundreds of Templar properties across France. The Templars, expecting no attack from the most Christian king, whom they had served faithfully, were taken completely by surprise. There was almost no resistance. In Paris, the Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, was arrested. He had recently arrived in France to discuss a new crusade with the Pope. He was taken in the Temple, his own headquarters. In a single day, the entire flower of the mighty order within France, thousands of knights, sergeants, and servants, was in royal prisons. Their vast treasures, accumulated over 2 centuries, were confiscated. The operation was a brilliant demonstration of the power and efficiency of the state machine Philip had built. It showed how far the centralization of power had come. No feudal lord, no coalition of barons could have accomplished such a thing. Only a king with a vast bureaucratic apparatus and absolute power was capable of such a coordinated and total strike. Friday the 13th forever entered history as a symbol of misfortune and betrayal, and for the Knights Templar, it was the beginning of the end. Immediately after the arrests, the second and most terrible part of the plan was launched: the confession machine. The captured Templars were handed over to the Inquisitors, who worked in close cooperation with royal officials. For medieval justice, especially the Inquisition, a confession was the queen of proofs, and the most effective way to get that confession was torture. The knights, accustomed to the pain of battle, were subjected to a different kind of systematic, sophisticated torment, designed to completely break their will. They were kept in cold, damp dungeons, starved and dehydrated. They were hung on the rack, their joints dislocated. Their bones were crushed in special presses. Their feet were burned over slow fires until the skin and flesh peeled away to the bone. The psychological pressure was just as brutal. Interrogators constantly told them that their brothers had already confessed, that the Grand Master himself had repented, that their order was cursed and forgotten. In this atmosphere of total horror, pain, and hopelessness, even the strongest warriors broke. One by one, they began to confess to everything demanded of them, denying Christ, worshipping an idol, practicing sodomy. Many signed pre-written protocols without even reading them, just to make the unbearable torment stop. In Paris, it is reported that of 140 knights interrogated, 36 died under torture before they could even be tried. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, broken by the ordeal, also incriminated himself and his order. These confessions, extracted under torture, were immediately documented, notarized, and mass-produced. They became Philip's primary weapon. He now had irrefutable proof of the Templars' guilt, in their own words. He could present them to the world not as victims of his tyranny, but as exposed criminals who had confessed to monstrous deeds. The confession machine worked without fail, turning living men into parchment sheets filled with the required testimony, which could now be used to legalize the lawless. Armed with stacks of confessions, Philip moved to the next phase, legalizing his tyranny. He sought to frame the entire crackdown as a model legal process, with himself not as the aggressor and debtor, but as the pious monarch, defending the faith from a terrible heresy. His genius, and that of his legists, was fully revealed in how brilliantly they used existing legal norms to achieve completely lawless ends. The trial was conducted by the Inquisition, which gave it the appearance of a church court, not a secular one. However, the inquisitors in France were under the king's complete control. The Grand Inquisitor was his personal confessor. Royal lawyers like Guillaume de Nogaret acted as prosecutors, reading out long lists of crimes and excerpts from the sincere confessions at public sessions. Show trials were organized, where professors from the University of Paris, prelates, and townsfolk were gathered to be shown the proof of the Templars' guilt. The propaganda machine ran at full power. Philip acted not like an Oriental despot, but as a predecessor to the totalitarian leaders of the 20th century. He understood the importance of procedure, of the legal veneer. He didn't just rob, he expropriated based on the law. He didn't just kill, he sentenced to death by court order. This mask of legality was necessary. First, to appease his own conscience, if he had one. Second, to paralyze any domestic opposition, since defending convicted heretics was mortally dangerous. And third, most importantly, to pressure Pope Clement V. The king presented the pontiff with a fait accompli. The crime has been uncovered, the criminals have confessed, and now all that remains is to formally dissolve their criminal organization. Any attempt by the Pope to defend the order would now look like defending heretics, which would be political suicide. Pope Clement V, watching from his Avignon captivity, was horrified. Initially, he protested Philip's actions, declaring that a trial of a military monastic order was the exclusive prerogative of the Holy See. He even suspended the inquisitors' activities. But Philip was ready for this. He launched a campaign of blackmail that became a classic of political intrigue. The king's legists revived talk of the necessity of a posthumous trial against Boniface VIII for heresy. The threat was direct and clear. If Clement did not yield on the Templar issue, Philip would destroy the papacy's reputation. Simultaneously, the king convened the Estates General, which, unanimously, begged their monarch to continue the fight against the Templar heresy and sent an embassy to the Pope demanding he not obstruct justice. Caught in a vice, Clement broke. He made concessions that amounted to a full capitulation. In August 1308, at Chinon, he personally interrogated the high dignitaries of the order, including Jacques de Molay. As the recently discovered Chignon parchment affirms, he absolved them of their sins and lifted the excommunication, acknowledging their confessions had been extracted under pressure. This was his desperate attempt to save the men by sacrificing the organization. But it could no longer stop the machine. Yielding to Philip's pressure, the Pope issued the Bull Pastoralis Praeeminentiae. In it, citing the confessions of the Grand Master himself, Clement called on all Christian monarchs to arrest the Templars in their own lands and place their property under the Church's protection. With this act, the Pope effectively betrayed the order. He spread the persecution throughout Europe, legitimizing Philip's actions and giving him what he craved most, the appearance of universal support. The puppet had performed his master's will. Despite the Pope's betrayal and the brutal torture, some within the order refused to submit and attempted to resist. When a papal commission began its work in Paris in 1310, hundreds of Templars suddenly appeared before it, massively recanting their previous confessions. They declared they had confessed only under unbearable torture and were now ready to defend the honor and innocence of their order. They were led by two educated and courageous knights, Pierre de Bologna and Renaud de Provins. They acted as true defense lawyers, presenting a coherent and well-argued case. They spoke of the order's glorious history and its defense of the Holy Land. They described in detail the tortures they had endured. They pointed out the absurdity and contradictions in the accusations. For a moment, it seemed the order had a chance. The papal commissioners were impressed. Even Jacques de Molay, who had previously urged his brothers to submit, found new courage and declared he was ready to defend the order to the end. This attempt at resistance was the most dramatic moment of the entire process. It was a ray of light in the darkness. The chained prisoners had become the accusers, challenging the most powerful monarchy in Europe. They appealed to justice, to law, to the consciences of the judges. But they underestimated one thing: the iron will of their enemy. Philip could not allow his perfectly constructed case to collapse, and he struck back with a terrifying and exemplary cruelty. In response to this defiant defense, Philip demonstrated that his power knew neither legal nor moral bounds. He delivered a swift and crushing blow meant to silence all resistance for good. On his direct order, the Archbishop of Sens, Philippe de Marigny, the brother of his all-powerful minister, convened his own local council. This council, completely controlled by the king, quickly reviewed the cases of 54 of the Templars who had dared to recant their confessions and defend the order. The verdict was predictable and monstrous. According to inquisitorial rules, a person who confessed to heresy and then recanted was considered a relapsed heretic. Such an individual was to be immediately handed over to secular authorities to be burned at the stake, with no right of further appeal. On May 12, 1310, these 54 knights, the pride of the order, were burned alive on the outskirts of Paris. This was not an execution. It was an act of terror aimed at everyone else. The king was sending a clear message. Anyone who dared to retract their original testimony would end their life in the fire. The effect was devastating. The order's defense was decapitated and demoralized. Many who had been ready to fight were terrified into silence. Pierre de Bologna mysteriously vanished from prison, never to be seen again. The papal commission was paralyzed by this blatant act of lawlessness, committed in defiance of its authority. Philip had proven once again that he, not the Pope, was the master of France. He showed he was willing to commit mass murder to see his plan through. The pyres lit in May of 1310 illuminated the final stage of the tragedy, turning the trial into a bloodbath and leaving the order with no hope of salvation. After the brutal execution of the order's defenders, the path to its official liquidation was clear. The final act of this drama was set to unfold at the General Council, which Pope Clement V convened in the city of Vienne in southern France. The council opened in October of 1311, its main task to decide the fate of the Knights Templar. Despite all of Philip's efforts, the majority of the attendees, especially bishops from other countries, where torture had not been widely used, were inclined to grant the order the right to defend itself. This ran directly counter to the French king's plans. He could not permit an open debate that might cast doubt on his entire version of events. And so, Philip resorted to his final and most persuasive argument: brute military force. In March of 1312, he personally arrived in Vienne, accompanied by a large army. It was an undisguised show of force, a direct ultimatum to the Council Fathers and the Pope. The message was clear: either you make the decision I want, or I will make it myself. Under this pressure, any semblance of free discussion became impossible. Pope Clement, utterly broken, found a compromise that was, in reality, a total betrayal. To avoid a public condemnation of the order for heresy, which would require a long and scandalous trial, he decided to dissolve it by his own supreme authority as an administrative measure. On April 2, 1312, he issued the Bull Vox in excelso. In it, he stated that although the order's guilt had not been legally proven at the council, due to the terrible reputation it had acquired and the suspicion surrounding it, for the good of the Church and to avoid scandal, he, the Pope, by his apostolic power, was dissolving the Knights Templar forever. It was a legal loophole that allowed Philip to achieve his goal while letting the Pope save face. The order was destroyed, not by a court verdict, but by the will of a terrified pontiff. The great military monastic organization, which had existed for nearly 2 centuries, ceased to exist with the stroke of a pen. After the order's formal dissolution, one last crucial question remained for Philip: the division of its colossal wealth. On paper, everything looked proper. The next papal bull, Ad Providam, transferred all Templar property, lands, castles, money, and debts, to their eternal rivals, the Order of Hospitallers. This decision was meant to placate public opinion, as wealth gathered to defend the Holy Land would remain with another military order. In practice, however, it was far more cynical. Philip had no intention of handing over the spoils for which he had fought so long and so bloodily. He immediately presented the Hospitallers with a gigantic bill, demanding compensation for the costs the crown had incurred during the lengthy trial. The sum of this compensation was astronomical, essentially equal to the value of the assets themselves. For years, royal officials delayed the transfer of assets, selling off the most valuable property, collecting revenues from the lands, and seizing the cash. In the end, the Hospitallers received only a small, bled-dry fraction of what the Templars had possessed in France. Philip had achieved his ultimate goal. He had not just destroyed his ideological rival, he had committed the largest and most successful robbery in medieval European history. The debt he owed the order was not merely cancelled, it was turned into a colossal profit. He paid his obligations by taking everything his creditor had, and more. This final act of financial looting, hidden behind papal bulls and legal procedures, became the cynical epilogue to the entire story. It definitively revealed the true motives of the Iron King, for whom the fight for the faith was just a screen, and state interest was the only true religion. The great debt was burned, first in the flames of the pyres, and then melted down into coin in the crucibles of the royal treasury. The story, it seemed, was over. The order was dissolved, the wealth divided, the victorious king triumphant. But fate had prepared an unexpected and ironic finale, one that would turn Philip's triumph into a prologue for his own downfall. In March of 1314, the 4 highest leaders of the order were brought before a commission of cardinals: Grand Master Jacques de Molay, Geoffrey de Charnay, Hugh de Perrault, and Geoffrey de Gonville. After 7 years in prison, all that was required of them was to publicly reaffirm their confessions and accept a sentence of life imprisonment. Gonville and Perrault complied, but when it was Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charnay's turn, the unthinkable happened. These 2 old men, their wills seemingly long broken, suddenly found their voices. Before all of Paris, assembled on the square in front of Notre Dame, they loudly and clearly recanted all their testimony. Jacques de Molay declared that the Knights Templar was holy and pure before God, and that all confessions had been torn from him and his brothers by torture and fear of death. He said his only sin was to have shamed the great order to save his own life, and he was now ready to die to atone for that sin. It was an act of incredible courage, a suicidal challenge to the all-powerful king. For Philip, who was present, it was an unheard-of insult, a public slap in the face. His perfectly staged spectacle was ruined. His 7 years of work to blacken the order could be undone by the dying words of 2 old men. The Iron King's reaction was immediate and furious. Consulting no one, bypassing all legal procedure, he declared de Molay and de Charnay relapsed heretics and ordered them burned at the stake that very evening. The irony is that this very spontaneous act of rage is what granted the Templars immortality. The execution turned the broken prisoners into martyrs, and the legendary curse of Jacques de Molay, shouted from the flames, forever etched their story into the annals of world mysticism. The king who tried to erase the order from history had, with his own final, cruel gesture, made them eternal legends. Death came for the main actors of this tragedy with frightening speed, as if confirming the curse from the pyre. First, just 1 month after de Molay's execution, Pope Clement V died. Guillaume de Nogaret, the chief architect of the trial, may have died even earlier, but the circumstances are murky. Finally, in the autumn of that same year, 1314, it was the Iron King's turn. The 46-year-old Philip IV, always in robust health, either fell from his horse during a hunt or suffered a stroke. He died in November, failing to outlive the year prophesied by the Grand Master. But the curse, as the legend holds, did not stop there. It fell upon all his descendants. His 3 sons, who ruled France one after another, all died young, leaving no male heirs. With them, the direct line of the Capetian dynasty, which had ruled for over 3 centuries, was extinguished. This dynastic catastrophe led directly to a conflict over the French throne between the English king Edward III, Philip's grandson through his mother, and Philip of Valois, his nephew. This dispute became the immediate cause of the 100 Years' War, the longest and most devastating conflict of the Middle Ages, which plunged France into decades of chaos, ruin, and suffering. Thus, the king who had dedicated his life to building a strong, unified state had, with his final actions, planted a bomb at its very foundation. The path that began with a desire to strengthen the crown ended in its greatest crisis, as if history itself was mocking his titanic efforts. The legacy of Philip IV is as paradoxical and complex as his personality. To some, he is a great statesman, one of the founding fathers of modern France, a monarch who, with an iron will, ripped the country from the shackles of feudal anarchy and church dictate, laying the foundations for absolutism and national sovereignty. He created an efficient bureaucracy, reformed the legal system, convened the First Estates General, and turned France into Europe's most powerful state. From this perspective, The destruction of the Templars, however cruel, was merely a necessary and logical step toward that great goal, the removal of the last obstacle to complete state control. To others, he is a cynical and ruthless tyrant, the counterfeiter king, whose reign was marked by financial predation, legal travesties, and bloody purges. He subjugated the church, but did so through humiliation and blackmail. He strengthened the law, but turned it into an instrument of repression. He destroyed the Templars, but did so using slander, torture, and a show trial, committing one of the most notorious acts of injustice in history. In his figure, two eras converged: the departing Middle Ages, with its religious wars and belief in heresy, and the dawning modern era, with its cult of the state, raison d'etat, and cynical pragmatism. This look across the centuries gives no simple answer. Philip was both a builder and a destroyer. He built a new, modern state, but on a foundation of lies and violence, and the story of the Templars became his most famous and most terrible monument, an eternal reminder of the price sometimes paid for the birth of the Leviathan, and how easily a great goal can be used to justify the vilest means. And so we arrive at the final solution to the central paradox. He owed the Templars. How did the king burn his greatest debt? Philip was able to burn his debt because he brilliantly reframed its very nature. He transformed a financial problem into a theological one. A debt expressed in livres and sous was transformed into a debt owed by all of Christendom to God, who supposedly demanded purification from heresy. This maneuver allowed him to deploy the most powerful and feared tool of the age, the Inquisition. He burned his debt in the literal sense, in the flames of pyres, because fire was the only legitimate punishment for heretics, and the only way to not just physically destroy his creditors, but to erase their memory as a holy order, turning them into cursed apostates. The key to how lies in a synthesis of three factors. First, the existence of his powerful, centralized state machine. Second, the subjugation of papal power through blackmail in the Avignon move, which stripped the order of its only defender. And third, most importantly, his masterful use of legal and propaganda technologies. He did not act like a barbarian conqueror. He acted as a lawyer, an investigator, a defender of the faith. He used torture to get confessions, and confessions to create the veneer of legality. He won, not on the battlefield, but in the courtroom, in the minds of the people, and on the pages of the trial records. The paradox is that to destroy a fundamentally medieval institution, a knightly order, he used both medieval methods, torture, pyres, belief in heresy, and modern ones, state propaganda, total surveillance, bureaucratic control, and the subordination of justice to political will. His debt was not just financial, it was ideological. The Templars, as a transnational corporation loyal only to the Pope, were a challenge to his very idea of absolute national sovereignty. Therefore, by burning them, he wasn't just getting rid of creditors. He was clearing the construction site for his new world, where the only God would be the state, and he would be its only prophet. In the end, the story of Philip the Fair and the fall of the Knights Templar goes far beyond a medieval chronicle of a king and his debts. It is a universal, timeless myth about the nature of power, about the birth of the state Leviathan, and about the price humanity pays for order and security. This story is a dark mirror into which any era can look and recognize its own features. It shows how easily the national interest, when taken to an absolute, transforms from a tool for protecting citizens into a machine for oppressing them. It demonstrates how law can mutate from a guarantor of justice into its chief gravedigger, and how a fight for purity, of faith or ideology, can become a convenient pretext for eliminating rivals and seizing their property. Philip IV was not an insane tyrant. He was, most likely, a rational ruler who sincerely believed he was right. And that is precisely what makes him so frightening. He showed that the most terrible crimes are committed not in the name of evil, but in the name of good, as defined by those in power. The story of the Templars is an eternal warning about the fragility of any independent organization when faced with an omnipotent state. It is a story about how, when power decides you owe it something, it alone chooses the method and the currency of repayment. And sometimes, that currency is not gold, but ash. This lesson, written in blood and fire 700 years ago, remains relevant today. It reminds us that the most dangerous debt is the one that power owes to its own insatiable hunger for more power, a debt it is always willing to burn along with anyone who gets in its way.